There is a particular kind of stillness that lives in the body of someone who has been called lazy their whole life. A stillness that looks like nothing from the outside, but from the inside feels like carrying 100 unfinished rooms. Maybe you've felt this, the dishes waiting, the email unanswered, not because you don't care, because something heavier than tiredness is sitting on your chest. You've probably heard the word thrown around like a diagnosis: lazy, unmotivated, undisciplined. As if the human being in question simply woke up one day and chose to disappear from their own life. But nothing about human behavior is that simple, and nothing about stillness is ever truly empty. What looks like laziness from a distance often looks like something else entirely up close. Not absence, a kind of protection. Think about the last time you avoided something small: a phone call, a form, a conversation you knew you needed to have. It wasn't really about the task. It rarely is. Underneath that avoidance was probably a flicker of fear, a whisper of not enough, a tiny prediction that failure was waiting on the other side of trying. This is where psychology quietly enters the room. There's a term for this: learned helplessness, the belief, often built slowly over years, that your actions don't actually change your outcomes, not lack of ambition. Learned defeat. You were not born believing that effort was pointless. Somewhere, someone or something taught you that trying didn't matter, that no matter how hard you pushed, the result stayed the same. And once the brain learns that lesson, it starts to protect you from the disappointment of trying again. What the world calls laziness is often the nervous system's way of saying, "I've been hurt by hope before." Not stubbornness, self-preservation. There's another piece of the puzzle that rarely gets spoken about gently: the idea of locus of control, which simply means where you believe the power over your life actually sits. Some people feel like the author of their days. Others feel like a character being written by circumstances beyond their reach. When your locus of control tilts outward, when you start believing that outcomes depend on luck, other people, timing, anything but your own hands, motivation quietly starves. Why plant a garden you don't believe you're allowed to harvest? Maybe you've asked yourself quietly in the dark, why can't I just start? Not because you're broken, but because starting requires believing that beginning leads somewhere, and somewhere along the way that belief cracked. Not weakness, grief in disguise. And here is where the conversation deepens, because underneath so much of what looks like extreme laziness is not an absence of desire, but an overwhelming presence of it, desire so large, so tangled, that it becomes paralyzing instead of motivating. This is sometimes called overwhelm-induced avoidance, though you don't need the clinical language to recognize the feeling. You want the life. You want the body, the career, the peace, the version of yourself that wakes up early and finishes what they start. But the distance between here and there feels so vast that the mind, in its strange mercy, simply shuts the door instead of walking through it. Not laziness, fear wearing comfortable clothing. There's a certain tenderness in understanding this, because so many people who carry the label of lazy are actually exhausted in ways that don't show up on the outside. Not physically tired, emotionally depleted. Mentally overworked by thoughts that never stop analyzing, judging, predicting failure before it even has the chance to arrive. This is decision fatigue, and it doesn't care whether the decisions are large or small. Every choice, every tiny act of picking one thing over another, drains a battery that was never given the chance to recharge. By the time evening comes, or sometimes even morning, that battery reads empty, not unwillingness, depletion. Have you ever noticed how the most unproductive days often follow the most invisible battles? A restless night, an old memory that resurfaced, a quiet ache no one else could see. The mind doesn't separate emotional pain from physical pain the way we assume it does. Both drain the same nervous system. Both use the same limited resource. So when you couldn't get off the couch, when you scrolled instead of studied, when you slept instead of showed up, that wasn't a character flaw playing out. That was a nervous system quietly begging for rest disguised as retreat. There's also a chemical thread running through all of this: dopamine, the molecule most people associate with pleasure, though it's really more about anticipation than pleasure itself. Dopamine doesn't reward you for finishing things. It rewards you for expecting a reward. This is why scrolling feels easier than starting, because the phone offers 100 tiny hits of anticipated reward within seconds, while a long-term goal offers nothing but delayed, uncertain payoff. Not because you're addicted to doing nothing. Because your brain is doing exactly what brains are designed to do, chasing the fastest, most predictable spark of relief. Not laziness, chemistry misunderstood as character. And once you understand that, doesn't a little bit of shame quietly lift? Doesn't it feel different to know that the pull toward the path of least resistance isn't a personal failing, but a universal human wiring issue that simply gets louder in certain minds? at certain times, for certain reasons. There's a psychological concept worth sitting with here: cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when your actions and your beliefs don't match. You believe you should be productive, disciplined, on track, but your actions day after day tell a different story. And instead of closing that gap through change, the mind often closes it through denial or self-punishment, because that feels faster than the slow, uncomfortable work of actually shifting behavior. So you call yourself lazy, worthless, hopeless, not because it's true, but because criticism feels like control when nothing else does. Not honesty, a wound talking. Maybe you've noticed how the harshest voice in your head sounds suspiciously like disappointment from your past. A parent, a teacher, a version of the world that decided you were not enough long before you had the language to defend yourself. This is where attachment theory quietly enters, because the way we were loved or not loved, consistently or unpredictably, shapes how safe we feel taking up space in our own lives. If effort was met with criticism as a child, effort can start to feel dangerous as an adult. If rest was seen as failure, rest can start to feel like guilt instead of restoration. What looks like extreme laziness in adulthood is sometimes just an old survival strategy still running quietly in the background, decades after the danger has passed. Isn't it strange and a little heartbreaking how the body keeps guarding doors that no longer need guarding? There is also a quieter, more philosophical layer beneath all of this: the question of meaning. Because motivation rarely fails in a vacuum. It fails most often when purpose has gone missing. When the why behind an action has been buried under obligation, comparison, or exhaustion, the how becomes almost impossible to access. You cannot force discipline onto a life that no longer feels like it belongs to you. So when someone appears endlessly unmotivated, the deeper question is rarely, how do I make them work harder? It's closer to, when did they stop believing their effort was for something real? Not apathy, a quiet mourning for a self they lost touch with. Perhaps you felt that exact ache, not wanting to be doing nothing, but not remembering what wanting anything even feels like anymore. That numbness, that flatness, is sometimes closer to a mild depressive state than to laziness at all, though very few people are gentle enough with themselves to name it that way. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like stillness mistaken for choice. And this is where the conversation must slow down, must soften, because there's a difference between someone avoiding effort out of comfort and someone who has quietly lost their sense of agency altogether. The first can often be nudged gently back into motion. The second needs something deeper than motivation. They need safety first. Not motivation, restoration. You can't discipline your way out of a nervous system that doesn't feel safe enough to try. No amount of productivity advice, no 5-step morning routine, no motivational quote taped to a mirror fixes a mind that has learned again and again. That effort leads to pain. What actually helps is smaller, quieter, less impressive than anyone wants to admit, tiny proof, repeated gently, that trying again won't destroy you. Not a leap. A single small step taken without judgment. Isn't it interesting how the people who seem the most unmotivated are often the ones who feel the most, who think the most, who carry entire unspoken worlds inside them that never make it to the surface? Stillness is not the same as absence. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is fighting the loudest internal war anyone will never see. There's a kind of grace in recognizing that behind almost every pattern the world calls laziness, there's a story, an old wound, a nervous system doing its best with outdated information, a heart that got tired of hoping and decided silence was safer than disappointment. Not a flaw to fix, a signal to understand. And here's where the emotional weight begins to soften into something more peaceful, because once you stop treating stillness as the enemy, you start to notice the wisdom hiding inside it. Rest is not the opposite of purpose. Sometimes rest is the only language the body has left to ask for care, not surrender, communication. Maybe the question isn't why can't you make yourself do more? Maybe the real question is, what has your life been asking of you for so long without ever asking if you had anything left to give? Consider, too, how much of modern life quietly punishes stillness while glorifying constant motion, as if worth were measured only in output, only in checked boxes, only in how tired you are by 9 at night. In a world like that, choosing to pause, even involuntarily, can feel like a moral failure instead of what it often actually is: a nervous system's last, quiet act of self-respect. Not weakness. A boundary the body drew when words weren't available. There's something almost sacred in that, isn't there? The body refusing to keep performing a version of productivity that was slowly killing something softer underneath. Burnout rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in disguised as procrastination, as apathy, as the couch feeling heavier than any bed ever has. And by the time it's finally named, the person carrying it has usually already spent months, sometimes years, quietly blaming themselves for something their body was trying to protect them from the entire time. Think about how differently this all reads once compassion enters the room instead of judgment. Not why are you like this, but what happened to make stillness feel safer than movement. Not what's wrong with you, but what were you never given the space to heal. The shift is subtle, but it changes everything, not correction, understanding. And still, understanding doesn't mean staying frozen forever. There's a quiet difference between honoring rest and disappearing into avoidance so completely that life itself starts to feel unreachable. The goal was never to romanticize stillness into permanence. The goal was to understand it enough to eventually move through it gently without the old shame riding along for the journey. This is often where small, almost embarrassingly simple shifts begin to matter more than grand transformations, noticing one unfinished thought and finishing it, no matter how small. Not because the world demands it, because you remember faintly that you are allowed to want something and follow it without punishment waiting on the other side. Isn't it curious how the people most afraid of failing are often the ones who never even attempted, because in their mind, not trying protected them from ever truly losing. There's a strange safety in staying still. If you never begin, you never have to face the version of yourself that might not succeed. But there's also a slow erosion hidden inside that safety, a quiet grief for the life that could have unfolded if fear hadn't been mistaken for foresight, not procrastination, preemptive heartbreak softened into inaction. And yet, beneath every one of these patterns, the avoidance, the numbness, the endless scrolling instead of starting, there remains something untouched, something that never actually left. A person still capable of wanting. A person still carrying dreams quietly, even when their hands have forgotten how to reach for them. Not gone, dormant. Maybe that's the gentlest truth in all of this, that extreme stillness is rarely the end of desire. It's desire waiting for enough safety to move again. It's hope paused, not extinguished. A flame kept low, not out. There's a certain peace in realizing that you were never lazy in the way the world used that word against you. You were tired in ways language rarely captures precisely. You were protecting something fragile the only way you knew how. You were surviving a version of life that asked more of you than it ever gave back, and stillness became the only answer your body had left to offer. Not everyone who looks unmotivated has given up. Some are simply resting at the bottom of something they're still trying to understand, waiting quietly for the moment trust returns before movement does. And when you think about it long enough, doesn't it soften something in your chest to realize that even now, in this exact moment, wherever you are, whatever version of stillness you're living inside, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are simply mid-story in the quiet chapter before the next beginning, the one that always feels the longest, the heaviest, and somehow eventually becomes the one that made sense of everything that came after.